Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. Certain aid is making its way to the Gaza Strip, but not fuel, as hospitals struggle to keep generators running. Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari will have the latest on the war between Israel and Hamas, including reports that Hamas was set to use chemical weapons. And the Crown has dropped a bail violation charge against Freedom Convoy organizer Tamara Leach. We have the latest.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. A small aid convoy was able to get into Gaza earlier today, but Israel is still not allowing any fuel shipments. Hospitals in the region say they're struggling to keep generators running to power life-saving equipment and incubators for premature babies.
هنا في نقص إمكانيات في المستشفيات وإحنا خايفين في ظل هالظروف الراهنة تتأزم الأمور أكثر من هيك وما نلاقيش علاج لأولادنا وكل الأمور صعبة علينا.
مرضى غسيل الكلى ومرضى أو أطفال الخدج والحضانات والولادة. الآن بات هذا المستشفى يخدم أضعاف ما يمكن أن يقدمه من خدمة. الخدج الآن في خطر شديد.
The Israeli military continues to pound the Gaza Strip. The latest bombing at a market in Gaza on Sunday killed at least 10 people and wounded many others. The war, which is now more than 2 weeks old, continues unabated. The Hamas-run health ministry says more than 5,000 Palestinians, including around 2,000 minors, have been killed over the past 16 days. Government officials in Israel, meanwhile, say more than 1,400 people in Israel died during the initial attack by the terrorist group Hamas back on October the 7th.
أكثر من 90 شهيد وصلنا منذ الصباح الباكر إلى مستشفى شهداء الأقصى في المحافظة الوسطى وكما تسمع دوي القصف بجوار مستشفى شهداء الأقصى الآن. هناك أيضا أكثر من 180 إصابة وصلتنا إلى مستشفى شهداء الأقصى جلهم من الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ.
The United States is advising Israel to delay an expected ground invasion to allow more time to negotiate the release of around 220 hostages. Hamas says they've released 2 more hostages, but Israeli government officials are investigating and have yet to confirm. Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari says Israel Defense Forces found a USB flash drive from a Hamas terrorist containing instructions to develop chemical weapons to be used against Israel.
These new developments just show the sheer level of hatred, monstrosity that was unleashed onto the Israeli population. And it's horrific to see all of this and see videos of the babies, see the videos of the hostages, and see a world that is so divided, a world that thinks that they have to give their opinion on the political policies. How can this be over land when they are beheading babies, when they are unleashing this kind of hatred, this kind of brutality on innocent civilians?
Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari will have the latest from the Israel-Hamas war coming up in the second half of our program. It appears as though support for Palestinians and Hamas may be growing. Protesters marched in a number of countries over the weekend, including in Italy, in support of the Palestinian people.
Israele compie crimini di guerra, crimini contro l'umanità, e la comunità internazionale non ha mai agito. Se siamo arrivati fino a qui, l'unica responsabilità della comunità internazionale, del silenzio della comunità internazionale. Ontario Conservative MP Melissa Lantsman says the federal government needs to do more to combat anti-Semitism. She says our federal government has failed many who are Jewish, including herself.
Imagine having lunch in a Jewish-owned business in downtown Toronto only to be shouted at because you're Jewish. Imagine being harassed outside your children's school where you've been told that they would be safe as they are escorted in by uniformed police officers. Imagine being told you shouldn't come to the office on a Monday morning, or maybe it would be wise to take off the religious identifier that was meant to signify your faith off your front door because it would make you a target. You don't have to imagine it. It's all happening here. here, and it's further fueled by the irresponsible statements pushed by the Prime Minister, who 6 days after repeating Hamas's talking points still hasn't corrected the record. Imagine being terrified in your own community and having a Prime Minister who hasn't said a word about it. Quite the opposite. He took the word of a terrorist organization over his own militaries and our allies and still hasn't retracted his statement.
A funeral was held for 40-year-old Samantha Wall. She's the president of a Jewish synagogue in Detroit who was stabbed to death outside of her home over the weekend. Police say they do not have a motive or a suspect as of yet.
We have in this room Muslims and Hindus, Catholics and Christians and Jews and all kinds of races, and everyone loved Sam and was affirmed by Sam.
Six people were killed and 14 others were injured following a missile strike on a Ukrainian mail depot in Kharkiv city. Officials believe it was a Russian rocket which caused the casualties. All victims were employees of the postal and courier outlet called Nova Poshta. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the strike as an attack on an ordinary civilian building.
Мої співчуття рідним та близьким загиблих. Ми обов'язково відповімо Росії на кожен прояв її терору і на цей удар також.
Well, Environment Canada issued a special weather statement for our region. It appears as though we may be seeing some of the white stuff sooner rather than later. Jeanette Rocher is now with an early look at the forecast. Jeanette, will the flurries be sticking around?
Yeah, it looks like right through Wednesday, Hal, we could see actually 2 to 4 centimeters tonight of that nasty white stuff. And I only say nasty because it is far too soon for this. We're not ready for it yet. Also 30 to 50 kilometer per hour winds this evening, another 40K tomorrow, and another 2 centimeters of the white stuff tomorrow, along with very low temperatures. We're looking at a temperature plunge down to -7, which is well below average for this time of year. On Wednesday, we could see another 60% chance of flurries. And then after that, we should be in the clear, and I'll be back later in the show to give you all those details. Hal?
Thanks so much, Jeanette. The Crown has dropped a bail violation charge against Tamara Leach, who was one of the Freedom Convoy organizers last year in our nation's capital. Prosecutors say it will free up court time to deal with her main criminal trial. Leach and Chris Barber face charges of mischief, counseling others to commit mischief, intimidation, and other offenses. Last week, the trial of Leach and her co-accused Barber stalled after the defense demanded more information about a software upgrade that wiped the data from the phones of at least 2 police officers following the protest. Legislative members from the NDP and PCs were sworn in on Monday in Manitoba. The October 3rd provincial election saw the NDP win 34 of 57 seats to secure a majority government. Cabinet ministers took their oaths as members of Executive Council last week. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew is expected to recall the legislature next month and outline his government's plans in a throne speech, although a date has yet to be set. Some big news coming out of Saskatchewan. The CFL's Rough Riders announced that they will not renew head coach Craig Dickinson's contract. This comes after the team lost 7 in a row and had their playoff hopes dashed following Saturday's 29-26 loss to the Toronto Argonauts. The Riders finished the season with a 6-12 mark and out of the playoff picture. While there's not yet been any word on Dickinson's replacement, the club announced that General Manager Jeremy O'Day has agreed to a new contract. The Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute is calling on all provinces to develop a plan to sustainably manage water use for the agri-food sector. The report says the cost of extreme weather is costing the agriculture industry billions upon billions of dollars. Farmers have been dealing with drought for many summers in a row now, and it only keeps getting worse as crops in certain regions lack irrigation. Now, to chat about this in more detail is Ken Coles, the Executive Director of Farming Smarter. It's a grassroots, farm-based agriculture innovation driver located right here in Lethbridge. Ken, is our irrigation sustainable here in southern Alberta?
Oh, that's a pretty good question. I sure hope so. I mean, we're in a situation where all of our reservoirs are pretty empty, and we're in desperate need for lots of snow in the mountains this winter. So cross our fingers, but I certainly believe that the long-term stability is there.
So what more needs to be done to really support our farmers and producers to ensure that our agri-food sector continues to thrive?
Well, the irrigation sector is special, right? And I think we sort of forget the fact that it's actually a really small amount of acreage, even in southern Alberta, like just south of Calgary. It represents about 1.7 million acres of land out of about 14 million. So the most important thing that we do for farmers is to preserve the water that falls from the sky, and that comes from good management practices, from the adoption of zero tillage, continuous cropping, reduction of fallow. All of those things are super important. And we tend to think about water management when it pertains to irrigation, but there's a whole string of different things that we need to consider to ensure that our agriculture as well. The irrigation sector itself, of course, is very valuable. We can produce crops that we couldn't otherwise, things like potatoes and sugar beets and dry beans. They're very high value crops. And then on top of that, we're supporting very valuable seed production industries like the hybrid canola seed and alfalfa seed production. So it's a very not just about food security, but it's hugely important to our economic development on that front. So in order to maintain and retain those industries, we need to be able to supply consistent water to those industries, both for the farmers and for the processors.
Thanks so much for your time today, Ken. That was Ken Coles, Executive Director and Professional Agrologist from Farming Smarter here in Lethbridge. A new study is being put together to look into how the St. Mary and Milk Rivers can better support our agricultural communities and what improvements need to be made in order to do so. It will be presented to the International Joint Commission in June of 2025. A professor of engineering at the University of Calgary says there was a time when Canadians didn't want any part of sharing water with our American neighbors.
So around 1909, as this canal system was being built, it's about 26 miles of canal. The Canadian farmers on the Canadian side of the border weren't too happy that water was being taken out of the Saskatchewan basin, and so they started building what they called the Spite Ditch. And the Spite Ditch is actually near the town of Milk River, and it was a ditch that was going to take the water in the Milk River as it was coming back into Canada and put it back into the Saskatchewan system. And so that caused a dispute between both countries. And so then it was decided that, cooler heads should prevail here, right? And we should share the waters. And so that's when the treaty started.
Make sure you catch the full interview with Al Pietronero, a professor of the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary, and myself, coming up after Business News. Police in Brooks say a collision late Friday afternoon left 3 people dead and several others injured. RCMP say the collision occurred on Highway 1 near Township Road 164 in the county of Newell, located south of Brooks. The initial investigation says a sedan exceeding the speed limit crossed the meridian and collided with a pickup truck. The 3 occupants of the sedan were pronounced dead at the scene. That includes a 37-year-old man and a 31-year-old woman, both from Medicine Hat, and a 33-year-old man from Redcliffe. The 6 occupants of the truck all survived and sustained various injuries. The investigation into the collision continues. 5 children and 1 adult were taken to hospital following a school bus rollover on a highway north of Calgary. Alberta RCMP say the incident occurred on Highway 2A, noting it was one of a number of collisions reported in the area due to freezing rain. Mounties could not confirm the extent of the injuries to those on board the school bus. A man in Taber has been arrested for child pornography offenses. Alert's Internet Child Exploitation Unit says the suspect allegedly uploaded child pornography via a social media platform. 25-year-old Brady Pavka was arrested and charged with accessing, possessing, and making available child pornography. A number of his mobile devices were seized. Pavka was released from custody but scheduled to appear in court on November the 21st. According to government statistics, 1 in 3 women worldwide experiences some form of sexual assault. Last Friday night, protesters of sexual violence took to the streets to take back the night in solidarity of ending gender-based violence. As BCN's Jeanette Rocher reports now, the YWCA Lethbridge District says it's a reminder of a discussion that should be taking place all throughout the year.
No more violence! No more violence! No more violence!
As the sun began to set in Lethbridge, they marched together. Men, women, and children to show solidarity and to empower those most vulnerable to take back the night.
Not the state! Women, Control their feet.
Take Back the Night is a global event. The first Canadian march was held in Vancouver in 1978. The Lethbridge event was held on the tail end of Week Without Violence and hosted by the YWCA Lethbridge and District.
You know, everybody is marching for their own story or someone that they may know. Actually, the reality is that nearly half of Albertans have suffered or experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And when we think about that number, that's staggering. It is close to 2 million individuals that have had or been affected by sexual violence.
In a tweet, Lethbridge Police Service stated that 1 in 3 women worldwide experience some form of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, that 1 in 6 men experience sexual violence, 2 in 3 transgender people have been sexually assaulted. People in the LGBTQIA+ community are more likely to experience sexual violence, and that less than 50% of victims report these crimes.
So for so many people who've been abused or assaulted is that they start to blame themselves and they feel enormous shame that comes with it.
Christine Cassie of the Chinook Sexual Assault Center explains why these crimes go so unreported.
People blame themselves even during the assault, where they think no one's going to believe me. We also know that this also keeps people from going forward to make those police reports. So it's a small percentage that actually go forward to make the police reports.
Going from blaming the victim, saying things like, don't wear that, stay away from dark corners, don't act like a victim. These are words that really put the blame onto the victim, and really we're not putting that narrative against the perpetrator.
But the good news, according to Cassie, is that there is no statute of limitations when it comes to sexually violent crimes.
We've seen people come through our doors, 20 years after the fact or 40 years after the fact saying, this happened to me and I thought I had dealt with it, but I haven't been able to sleep for weeks now.
What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now.
So they keep this as a very heavy burden for themselves, as if they are to blame when they aren't to blame. The only person to blame is the perpetrator.
If you're a victim of a crime or need more support, contact the Chinook Sexual Assault Center at 403-694-1094.
Save our bodies. Save our rights. Take a stand. Take action tonight.
For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Roche.
No more silence. No more violence.
As Albertans brace themselves for a visit from Old Man Winter, tire service shops are dealing with a huge influx of people in a panic to get their vehicles outfitted with winter tires. Simon Hendricks of Cal Tire, South Mayor McGrath, here in Lethbridge, says the phones are simply ringing off the hook right now.
We're booked out for at least the week. The weekend I've got some spots available. Next week I've got a lot of spots available. We've got some that are dropping off, leaving it with us till we can get to it. So we've got 5 or 6 of those already. And phones are ringing continuously. So it's kind of how many calls a day, it's hard to say. We have a retail call center that handles most of our phone calls out of Calgary, and then the rest get overflowed to us. Or if someone requests the front desk, it gets patched through.
Hendrick says when it comes to city driving, most motorists opt for all weathers as opposed to winter tires. That reminds me, I have to put on my winter tires. Well, it was feeling a bit like winter earlier today, really cool, windy. It was also cloudy and some snow mixed with rain in certain parts of southwestern Alberta. And more of the wet stuff is on the way. A full look at the weather picture is on deck. Environment Canada issued a special weather statement for our region here today. We should be seeing some of that snow mixed with rain. Jeanette Roche is now with all of the weather details. Jeanette, the cool, wet weather will remain with us here in southwestern Alberta for the next few days?
Yeah, it will. And you know what? We should actually consider ourselves a bit fortunate because we're only seeing that 2 to 4 centimeters tonight, another 2 centimeters on Wednesday, whereas places like Calgary seeing up to 15 centimeters. So yeah, I guess we should be considering ourselves fortunate compared to a little bit to our north. But -7 is what the temperature is plunging to over the next several days, and that is well below average for this time of year. -6 as well on Thursday with mainly overcast skies. Cloudy as well on Friday with -5 for the expected high, -1 on Saturday, partly cloudy skies, and then finally up to 5 degrees on a Sunday. So looking at a lot of minuses this week. I don't know, I don't like it considering the average high for this time of year, 12 degrees. Average low only -1. We're going to be below that, unfortunately. 27 was our high temperature. That happened back in 1965 on this day, and in 1991 on this day we were sitting at the chilliest, which was -13. Okay, so the sun rose close this morning at 8:05, sunset this evening, 6:25. We're looking at 10 hours, 20 minutes of daylight exactly. Over on the west coast, we're seeing showers beginning in the morning for both Victoria and Vancouver, high of 10 degrees. Victoria seeing up to 70 k winds in that Juan de Fuca Strait, and a bit windy as well in Vancouver, 30 to 50 k winds there, 8 degrees there. -5 for an expected high in Edmonton. They saw snow earlier today, but mainly cloudy skies tomorrow. Calgary under a significant snowfall warning, 9 degrees for the high tomorrow. This evening they're looking at 10 to 15 centimeters of snow, and could see another 2 to 4 tomorrow. Saskatoon also looking at 2 to 4 centimeters of snow tomorrow, -3 for a high, -1 in Regina. Could see snow mixed with some flurries, 7 degrees for a high in Winnipeg, mix of sun and cloud. That looks like the warm spot across the prairies. However, Manitoba is also going to be bracing for some plummeting temperatures over the next several days. They'll get into the minuses as well for you, Manitoba. Okay, in the central part of the country here, Toronto, loving this, 18 degrees for a high, 14 for a high in Ottawa, seeing a chance of showers there, 13 for a high in Montreal. Not bad at all. I think I should head east. Okay, over on in the Atlantic portion of the country, looking at 11 degrees for a high in Fredericton, lots of sunshine as well. In Halifax, 12 for a high of 12 degrees as well in Charlottetown, and high of 6 degrees only in St. John's, with a chance of showers there. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
With millions of Canadian mortgages coming up for renewal over the next few years, financial experts say many homeowners are facing the tough decision of whether to renew or refinance. Renewal means updating an existing mortgage contract with a new interest rate when the mortgage term expires, typically about 5 years. Refinancing involves breaking the current contract entirely and signing a fresh one to access home equity, consolidate debt, or switch lenders for a better rate. For folks with thinner wallets, however, refinancing also allows the borrower to extend their amortization period or the length of time to fully pay off the mortgage. The head of Via Rail says the federal government should consider a passenger bill of rights comparable to the one now in place for air travelers. Company CEO Mario Pelequin says Ottawa should move toward a charter that would ensure train passengers receive compensation for long delays. If the reason for the disruption stems from one of Canada's 2 main freight railways, whose tracks Via runs on, he says they would be the ones to pay up. He says that would further incentivize smooth operations along the line. Pelequin, who stepped into the top job at Via Rail back in June, is also calling for rules that would give the Crown Corporation's trains formal right-of-way over freight trains. That's a privilege Amtrak passenger cars currently enjoy in the United States. The United Auto Workers Union has once again escalated strike action against Detroit's top 3 automakers. This time, it's a factory that makes Dodge Ram pickup trucks for Stellantis. The union says in a statement that 6,800 members walked off the job Monday at the assembly plant in Sterling Heights, Michigan, which is a huge profit center for the company. The move came just 3 days after union president Sean Fain reported progress in talks with General Motors and Stellantis, but said the companies will have to make better offers. No progress was reported yet with Ford. The union went on strike September 15th at one assembly plant from each company. About 40,800 workers are now on strike against all 3 automakers. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 68 points on the day to finish at 19,046. The Dow was down 190 points to 32,936. The S&P 500 was down 7 on the day to 4217, and the Nasdaq was up 34 points to 13,018. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down $1.95 to $86.13 U.S. per barrel. Natural gas was up 2 cents to $2.92 U.S. Gold was down $8.56 on the day to $19.7284 U.S. an ounce, and silver was down 39 cents to $22.98 U.S. an ounce. Feed wheat is at $9.52 per bushel, barley's at $7.45, canola's at $15.40, and corn is at $8.58 per bushel. Live cattle were down $6.03 to $178.25. Feeder cattle were down $4.20 to $237.63, and lean hogs December contract was up 18 cents to $66.18. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to $73.03 U.S. Recapping one of our top stories, the Crown has dropped a bail violation charge against Tamara Leach, who was one of the Freedom Convoy organizers last year in Ottawa. Prosecutors say it will free up court time to deal with her main criminal trial. Leach, along with Chris Barber, face charges of mischief, counseling others to commit mischief, intimidation, and other offenses. The war between Israel and Hamas continues in the Gaza Strip. We'll have the latest from our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari shortly, including how the United States is sending more military aid to Israel. Listen, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to send us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And if you missed any of today's local stories, check out our website, bridgecitynews.ca.
Here's today's Bridge City News community calendar. Come and enjoy a fun and spooky time at the Fort Whoop-Up's Haunted House, October 27th and 28th. Opportunities to go through the fort's barracks are from 1 to 3 p.m. for kids and 6 to 9 p.m. for those 18 and older. Admission is $5 per person. To register, visit galtmuseum.com. Get ready for a spine-tingling Halloween extravaganza. Enjoy the hauntingly beautiful musical journey, Phantasms, with the Lethbridge Community Band Society's Gold Band, led by Mark Ward. Taking place Saturday, October 28th, beginning at 7 p.m. at College Drive Community Church. For tickets, visit lcbs.ca. Discover a new activity that you love. All are invited to Give It a Try events hosted by the Lethbridge Sport Council. It's a great opportunity to try your hand at a new sport like climbing, badminton, handball, and more. Events are free to attend. Register in advance by visiting lethbridgesportcouncil.ca/program/Give It a Try. And that's today's Bridge City News community calendar.
As the war between Israel and Hamas rages on along the Gaza Strip, there are reports that the terrorist group Hamas had plans to use chemical weapons on the Israeli people. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert and host of the Foreign Desk, Lisa Daftari, joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, according to a report by Axios, the Israeli Defense Forces found a USB flash drive containing instructions for crafting a cyanide dispersion device?
Right? Doesn't this take this war to another level? To imagine that the Hamas terrorists not only wanted to behead, burn alive, take families and shoot them execution style on a holiday, on a Sabbath, but they also wanted to unleash chemical weapons on a civilian population, an unprovoked terrorist attack on Israeli civilians, which was supposed to be even so much more than it already was. How these new developments just show the sheer level of hatred, monstrosity that was unleashed onto the Israeli population. And it's horrific to see all of this and see videos of the babies, see the videos of the hostages, and see a world that is so divided. A world that thinks that they have to give their opinion on the political policies. How can this be over land when they are beheading babies, when they are unleashing this kind of hatred, this kind of brutality on innocent civilians? I mean, as a journalist, I have been covering many, many wars. I covered ISIS in all of its brutality and all of its beheadings and all of its attacks. And I have never, ever seen anything like this. And to be honest with you, the most upsetting part about all of this is not the difficulty and the emotional distress of covering this horrific attack, but really the disappointment in humankind to watch the world divided and not being able to call out Hamas point blank. End point. That is it. Call out Hamas. This is just horrific. And I do hope that more people watch your newscasts and get the truth and understand the level at which they wanted to carry this out. And let me tell you one other thing, how when you have chemical weapons like this, when you have a desire like this, it's not going to stop with the people of Israel. We know that we have militants in other parts of the world. We know that they will unleash their attacks and their brutality and their hatred on all non-believers, and that includes atheists and Christians and even moderate Muslims. So the world better wake up is really the point of this story.
Lisa, the United States is further helping Israel in its battle against Hamas. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that the Pentagon is sending a terminal high-altitude area defense anti-ballistic missile battery and Patriot missile battalions to the eastern Mediterranean.
Right. So more fortifications being sent out to the East Mediterranean. We also have 2 carriers that were sent there earlier. The United States hoping that this is a deterrent, hoping that this is a symbolic deterrent and that they do not have to get involved. Also, I will add to this, we have 3 fronts within Israel, right? We have Hezbollah from the north, we have Hamas in Gaza, we have the West Bank, but also outside of Israel in the region, you have Syria, Iraq, Yemen, all proxies of Iran's regime that have weapons pointed towards Israel, but also using the opportunity to attack U.S. assets in the region. So the United States is already involved to a certain point in this proxy war of Iran's regime against the big Satan, the United States, and the small Satan, Israel. But the United States has distanced itself from the narrative that Iran's regime is even involved, hoping that Israel will just carry out its attack towards Hamas and that the United States can just stay behind as more of a supporting actor in this war.
We've been flying back a number of Canadians who are trapped by Hamas in Gaza and the Gaza Strip. And but there's word as well that U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says Hamas had been blocking up to 600 U.S. citizens from leaving Gaza. What's the latest there?
Yeah, I heard an interview with one of these women who went out there to visit family and now cannot get out. Look, Hamas will use any human being, whether they're American or Canadian or Palestinian, and especially Israelis, of course, as their victims, as the targets of their brutality. Each one playing a role in their narrative, each one helping them to win the PR war, each one of them helping to play a part in their terror reign over this region. The Americans, the Canadians, the Westerners who are stuck there, they have no way out. And the interview I heard was interesting because the woman said, "And we don't have bomb shelters like the Israelis do." And someone commented under this post in social media, "It's because Israelis are not throwing rockets at you indiscriminately throughout the year. You don't need bomb shelters in Gaza." So it's really not a political point to make. Get these innocent people out of harm's way, whether they're Palestinian, Canadian, or American. They should not be human shields. They should not be a part of this death toll that plays a part in the narrative of telling the story of Hamas.
Yeah, it's so tragic. We're seeing a lot of the stories of the bloody babies, the children. It breaks my heart, you know. Lisa, there's a passage in the Bible which says, "A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand." Well, according to U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, there appears to be passionate opponents of Israel who have infiltrated the Biden administration. Cruz says these anti-Israel elements are undermining U.S. President Joe Biden's ability to really stand firmly with America's longtime ally, Israel.
Yeah, it's no secret, Hal, from the first day that the squad, who he's referring to, but mostly spearheaded by Rashida Tlaib of Michigan and Ilhan Omar, who are in office sheerly to really bash Israel. From day one, they have shown no signs of loving America, of loving their country, of loving their constituency. But every time there's an opportunity to bash Israel and the United States' policy being allied with Israel, they take the opportunity to do so. And I will add this, they're lying. And that is what is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to not only put at risk Israel, the United States' ally Israel, but to lie in doing so. The hospital bombing last week was corrected by most mainstream media outlets who ran with the story incorrectly, right? If you remember how in the first hours, Hamas said that Israel bombed a hospital in Gaza, and everyone ran with it, and they said there were hundreds of casualties. There was no video to support this. There was no reports to support this, but the mainstream media, including the New York Times, the BBC, the Washington Post, all ran with it. Israel said, "Let us investigate." And sure enough, they knew that was not their policy to hit a hospital, but maybe there was an accident. They showed that an actual Palestinian missile hit the hospital by accident, and it was actually the hospital parking lot. The hospital is still standing. There could not have been that many casualties. So the whole story was fabricated and exaggerated. And these women in the squad refuse to correct the narrative. They have yet to walk back the story, and all they do is push for ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. I have not heard them once say, "Release the hostages." I have not heard them say, "Hamas is a terror organization." It is very dangerous to have these members of Congress, as Ted Cruz eloquently said, really, it is damaging to the United States policy. It's damaging to the United States as a whole, and they do not belong representing a country that they do not love and support.
You know, there's certain people in the mainstream media who refuse to call Hamas a terrorist organization. We do here at Bridge City News, but we're not mainstream media. But now the BBC is actually changing their narrative from militants to actually calling them a terrorist organization after a recent meeting with some of the Jewish leaders. And as well, they're going to be basically reinforcing what the UK government has said all along, that yes, in fact, they are a terrorist group. Now, Lisa, two professors who made anti-Semitic comments related to the Israel-Hamas war apologized, trying to kind of distance themselves from their previous statements. One is a professor in Chicago, Dr. Mike Tosca, who says Israelites should, quote, rot in hell. The other is Professor Richard Rickford, who teaches at Cornell University. He called the Hamas attacks on Israel exhilarating and energizing. Lisa, how do these guys still have jobs?
How do they have jobs? How? This is a culture at the university level, especially at elite universities, to be anti-Israel. These individuals took it a step further to really put in their personal gusto in making these remarks, now only walking it back because there are consequences. This is where cancel culture works both ways. They only thought it worked their way, but now it's working against them. How there are so many examples. We had here in Los Angeles an oncologist, a very renowned oncologist, and he lost his job at many of the offices with which he rounded. And it's incredible to see professionals of this level show so much hatred. Would they get away with it if they showed hatred toward any other group? I mean, it's horrific to think that in the year 2023, whether you're a professor or a doctor, you're work in a. There was one girl who worked at Citibank. There are calls being made to these offices to get rid of these people for there to be consequences for their actions, and it's horrific. Again, how to think that they can get away with it and that they can maintain these positions, particularly at the university level. They teach their version of history, which obviously is very slanted, but and again, it's very anti-American. I'm sure it's anti-Canadian. It's anti-established. But that's what the university in this day and age and the woke age is meant to do. But to put that kind of hatred towards any one group, how is that showing tolerance or what they pretend to preach? I'm very glad that there are consequences. I do hope that these universities do not allow these individuals to be in their positions and do not accept their apologies. It's one thing to apologize if you truly mean it, but another to do that just because you want to keep your job.
And you know what? Yet another professor at the University of California, Gemma DeCristo, took to social media blasting these, quote, Zionist journalists who spread propaganda and misinformation. She says, quote, they can fear their bosses, but they should fear us more. And that was followed by a knife, an axe, and some blood emojis. You would think some of these professors would be a little smarter than this.
Yeah, not only that, Hal, but this is a trans. He became a woman, a trans, who said, find these journalists, these American journalists, you know where their kids, you can find out where their kids go to school, you can find out where they live. Imagine inciting that kind of violence when you have that position, wow. When you come from what you claim is a minority group, when you want the rest of the world to respect you and your classification as trans. But you say this against, you want people to go, kill American journalists? I mean, it is so horrific, and I am so emotional about this because I am a journalist and I am covering this story to the best of my ability, but I am getting threats, and it is unacceptable. We're just trying to do our jobs. We're the ones who understand the context. We're the ones who understand the history, and you're the ones who can't even place Gaza on a map, but you're inciting violence against those who are doing their jobs. It's just so horrific. And Hal, you're not mainstream media, but you should be, because you're one of the honest journalists who is doing their job with integrity, covering all sorts of foreign policy stories with honesty and integrity. And I do appreciate you and your show.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We really appreciate that, our team here. Now, the president of the board of a synagogue in Detroit was found dead inside of her home. A tragic story here, Lisa. Police say 40-year-old Samantha Wall was stabbed to death. Another potential hate crime?
You know what, Hal? I've never seen a murder like this so quickly be classified as a crime with no motive. So quickly. And because of her position, because of who she is, obviously everyone's first assumption is that it was a hate crime. And she was very much, openly working towards bridging this gap between Arabs and Jews in the Michigan area, as you know, a very hostile place in many ways in terms of the two groups trying to coexist. But doing her job, trying to create that harmony between the two groups, and then having this be her fate. Obviously, there's a motive. Obviously, there has to be some sort of investigation, and they started to walk it back. And now, hopefully, they will be transparent as to what this was, who did this, who the perpetrators were, and what the exact motive was, as many people assume.
A court in Iran has sentenced 2 journalists to up to 7 years in prison, Lisa, for collaborating with the United States government. Both are women who have been in jail for over a year following the coverage of the death of Mahsa Amini.
Yeah, this just shows the exact leverage that the Iran regime believes that they have. Rather than reforming themselves, rather than coming around and giving women more rights and allowing this Mahsa Amini movement to have some air and some space, before they were very scared of the masses coming out onto the streets in this grassroots movement. For over a year, the Iranian people, spearheaded by the women, in the aftermath of the death of the 22-year-old who wore her hijab improperly. Now 2 journalists, their sole crime was covering that story, just doing their job, have been sentenced. Just shows you the brutality. And again, the world missing the biggest story, the elephant in the room here, that the Iran regime, the same one that sentences female journalists, that kills a girl, beat her to death because she wasn't wearing her hijab properly, is the same one funding Hamas to go in and behead babies and scoop people's eyeballs out and cut babies out of wombs. Same head of the octopus, as many people have said. Let's not focus on the tentacles. Let's get to the head of the problem. And that is the same regime that is sponsoring all these different terror proxies in the region that are targeting Western assets over there, Canadian, US, European, and really the mainstream media has lost this narrative.
She's our foreign affairs expert and host of the Foreign Desk. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
Thank you, Hal. Thank you so much for your good work.
For over a century, Canada and the United States have shared the waters of the St. Mary and Milk Rivers through negotiated agreements. The International St. Mary and Milk Rivers Study is a 4-year effort to determine if improvements can be made. The study will present its report to the International Joint Commission in June of 2025. Now, to chat about the study in more detail and how it will impact residents on both sides of the border is Al Pietranero. He's a professor at the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary. Al, welcome to Bridge City News.
Well, thanks for having me, Al. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about the study.
Oh, you bet, Al. Now, first of all, what is the focus and objective of this Milk River study?
So a lot of folks aren't really familiar with the actual basin itself, right? So for over 100 years now, there's been a diversion of water from the St. Mary system, and the St. Mary flows into the Saskatchewan River, right? And the Milk River actually starts in the US, comes up into Canada, goes back into the US, and the Milk River actually flows into the Missouri system, so it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so in about 1909, a diversion was built to take a higher yielding river, which is the St. Mary River, and move some water into the Milk River to allow for irrigation downstream on the US. And so there was a treaty established. It was actually the first treaty ever established between the US and Canada on water, to make sure that there was basically a fair sharing of water between both countries. And so there's rules and regulations about how much water can be diverted, how we account for that water. And over the years, what we've noticed in trying to manage the system is that both countries have not maximized the beneficial use of those waters because of timing and climate issues and just changes in the basin. And so the officers in charge of that treaty decided that it was maybe a good idea to have a study to see what has changed in the basin and if we can make better use of the water on both sides of the border.
Let's talk about the connection now between St. Mary and Milk Rivers and why the St. Mary Canal is so important for water supply during the hot and dry summer months.
So if you know the area at all, you'll know that the St. Mary River actually starts in the headwaters of the Saskatchewan Basin, around Glacier National Park on the US side, right? And so it's a high yielding basin. It has a lot of water, high mountains, lots of snowpack, right? If you look at the Milk River, It's kind of a foothills type of river, and so it's quite a bit drier. And doesn't yield nearly as much water, right? So it's more rainfall dependent than snow dependent, right? And so the volumes of water that go through that system are a lot less. And so if you're irrigating in Montana on the Milk River, sort of downstream of the Canadian border, there's just not enough water to supply to support that irrigation, right? And so that's why the structures were built.
So when did the original water sharing agreement between Canada and the U.S. for the St. Mary and Milk Rivers originate?
So it's an interesting story because it started in around 1909. I think around sort of the 1890s, 1900s, engineers in the U.S. were looking at that particular diversion. It's a really interesting diversion in the sense that it's all gravity fed. So there's no pumps. It's all gravity that takes the water from one watershed to another, which is pretty unique. But so around 1909, as this canal system was being built, it's about 26 miles of canal. The Canadian farmers on the Canadian side of the border weren't too happy that water was being taken out of the Saskatchewan basin, and so they started building what they called the Spite Ditch. And the Spite Ditch is actually near the town of Milk River, and it was a ditch that was going to take the water in the Milk River as it was coming back into Canada and put it back into the Saskatchewan system. And so that caused a dispute between both countries. And so then it was decided that, cooler heads should prevail here, right? And we should share the waters. And so that's when the treaty started. So 1909 was the beginning of the treaty. And in 1921 was when the orders were set out. So how much Canada gets versus how much the US gets, and sort of how the whole basin was going to be treated.
So Al, how has this agreement impacted the water access for both nations?
So, I think in general, it's been beneficial. Back in those days was really focused on irrigation and expansion of the West, as you well know. And so what it allowed for was actually expansion and irrigation on the U.S. side of the border, because there's water that gets stored in the Fresno Reservoir that comes through the system. But it also allowed for water supply on the Canadian side of the border as well, right, for the Milk River irrigators. So I think both countries benefited from the use. And oftentimes, if you look at the Milk River, let's say in July, probably 80–90% of the water flowing through the Milk River is actually U.S. water.
So Al, what factors in the watershed have really changed over time?
So a couple of things to think about in the basin itself. So one is, it's Glacier National Park on the U.S. side of the border, right? And so the glaciers have receded. And so, we've seen that impact in the water supply for sure. But we've also noted over the years that the weather patterns have changed, right? This year's, it's been particularly dry in some parts of the country, as you know, right, in some parts of the U.S. The June rains that we typically saw and expected don't happen as often and as kind of regularly as they used to happen, right? And so the actual climate of the system has changed a fair bit, right? And so that's a big part of why we're looking at this study. The other thing is the infrastructure has changed a little bit too, right? So the conveyance capacity of the canal isn't what it used to be, right? Things tend to erode over time, right? And so there's a lot of infrastructure that's kind of being looked at now, and so we're hoping that over time, the conveyance capacity, so how much water the system can actually push through, will increase over time to its kind of original design levels, and so we want to look at the impact of all those things. The last thing I'll say is, the way the treaty is organized is we actually allow for certain things to happen with respect to water sharing between both countries. And those are elements that, perhaps we should revisit, right? So we're looking at that as well. So we don't change the treaty per se. We just look at how we implement the treaty a little differently. And so we're looking at aspects there as well.
How much of a voice do Indigenous groups have in regards to this study and in regards to the water supply from both rivers?
Yeah, so part of the study, an important part of the study is, and actually initiated through the IJC, has been to have an Indigenous advisory group as part of this effort, right? And so we are listening to Indigenous voices on both sides of the border. And so we've had regular conversations with them. They're actually sitting on some of the science committees as well. So some of the work we're doing, the technical work we're doing, we've asked some of the Indigenous water managers to help us, understand the system. And so we really want to bring in an Indigenous perspective to the study as well, right? That's important. Times have changed and we need to keep up with that.
Let's talk about some of the other specialist groups as well involved in this study of St. Mary and Milk Rivers.
So the way those studies set up is and these studies are actually have been run across the country, right? There was a Souris River study done a few years back. There was one on the Great Lakes. There's one on the Richelieu River in Quebec as well, Lake Champlain. And they're all sort of set up to have a strong technical element. So we have a technical working group that's been developed. We look at different options, right? So we're looking at both structural and non-structural options to see, how we can improve the entitlements of water on both sides of the border. And so the technical working groups are typically made of people who actually work in the basin, right? So whether it's Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, people that work on managing water in Alberta, or whether it's the Montana authorities or the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, we bring all those experts together to set up an expert panel on all kinds of aspects, right? Socioeconomic, technical, structural, non-structural, other things. But next to that, we actually have a couple of advisory groups. I mentioned the Indigenous Advisory Group, but we also have a public advisory group. So we seek input from the public. We've had a number of town halls. We had one in Milk River. We had one in Havre. We're going to keep doing that over the course of the study. And we want public input to make sure that whatever we recommend to governments at the end of the day, right, the public has a buy-in into how we're doing that, right? So there's a public advisory group as well. And then to make sure that the science we're doing and the engineering we're doing is state of the art, we have an independent review group that reviews everything we do on the technical side. And lastly, this is all managed by a study board, right? And so I'm the Canadian co-chair, there's a US co-chair, and then we have 3 members for each country that make sure that everything's happening.
Let's talk a bit about the water table level, because I've noticed with a lot of reservoirs in the province here, they're drying up with the drought that we've had, a lot of the hot and dry weather. Is that weather also impacting some of the rivers?
Yeah, for sure, right? So we had a really early runoff this year, as you well know, right? And so waters have peaked. The Milk River is interesting right now because actually the Fresno Reservoir is actually doing quite well. There was a lot of rain in that specific part of the U.S., right? And these are why these things are difficult, right? So the Fresno Reservoir is actually reasonably full right now. And so I think, the basin's actually doing reasonably well this year because of that. Although it's really quite dry on the Canadian side of the border, right? And so the thing about this basin is there's not a lot of infrastructure. There's the diversion infrastructure, right? But there's not a lot of storage. And so, that's something we're going to look into with the study. But yeah, the only main storages really are on the U.S. side of the border, and they're managed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation on the Milk River. Of course, the St. Mary system is quite different, right? Once you get up towards Lethbridge, then you have the St. Mary Reservoir, which is a big storage facility, right, for irrigation for Alberta. But that's really kind of outside the limits of the study.
That's also drying up, I got to tell you.
Yes.
It is drying up right now. We've had quite a bit of dry and hot weather here. Al, let's talk specifically about the advisory groups participating in the study, and what role do they play in providing input and feedback on the work of the technical working groups?
So part of what we're trying to do or what we will do is really develop what we call indicators, right? And so we want to look at socioeconomic indicators. So look at if when water is available, people make the best use of it, right? How that's going to work. And so we need to talk to local farmers and irrigators to make sure that we're understanding, their perspectives in terms of the water allocations, right? And that's on both sides of the border, right? But there's also other groups, there's recreational users as well, right? Like I said earlier, there's the Indigenous groups as well, right? And so we want to make sure that all those perspectives are there. There's towns along the border, right? And that we have to respect that they have water supply and all those things. So really it's to get all that input to make sure that we understand what's important to the individuals who live in the basin, right? So that we can reflect that in looking at the various options we're gonna table. And make sure that we minimize the impacts to people, or we increase the net benefit to folks as well, right? And so So that's really why we need the public input, right? They're the ones that are affected by this, and so they need to have a major say.
Are there any findings from this study specifically that surprised you?
Well, you know, we're just getting started in a sense that the technical work's going on right now. I think we kind of know what to expect because we've been dealing with this basin a long time, right? And so we kind of know what to expect, but you know, we'll see down the road when we make the recommendations if there's anything that is surprising to us, right? There always are issues that sort of crop up that perhaps we hadn't thought of, right? And so that's why it's really important to get the public and Indigenous engagement there. And so, you know, we'll see what materializes. We're open to all the discussions that are coming down the road here, and you know, we want to do the best for the citizens in the region, right? So right now we think we kind of know where things are going to land, right? But we don't want to bias any decisions here, right? We want to be open to all considerations.
So bottom line, how will this study really benefit Albertans and other Canadians?
Well, I think in the Milk River Basin and on the St. Mary systems, right, it'll allow to ensure that the entitlements that Canada receives, right, are sort of for the most beneficial use, right? And so right now, in some years, right, Canada doesn't necessarily, especially on the milk system, isn't able to use all of its entitlements, right? Because the thing about water is sometimes it often comes at the wrong time of the year. And so how do you deal with that, right? So you need water to irrigate, let's say in July and August, right? Most of the water comes in May and June. You know, how should we fix that, right? And that's kind of where we're focused on. So in the end, I think it'll be a benefit to both the US and Canada.
So if viewers want to know more about this study, Al, where can they go? So
if they just do a Google on St. Mary Milk Study, it'll lead them to the IJC site and they can go straight there, and all the information is there, including the recent released sort of science plan that we have. And so people are encouraged to look at that and get back to us if they have any questions. There's an email that they can send emails to, and we'll do our best to answer any questions.
Al Pietranero is a professor at the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for your interest. Take care.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless. Thanks for watching.